Most of the battles of World War I were fought during the day, with major attacks usually occurring at the break of dawn. But what happened after dark? During the day, most attempts to leave the frontline trench and cross no man's land toward enemy lines were met with fierce defensive machine gun fire and artillery strikes. While daytime provided the obvious benefit of visibility, nighttime had its own advantages. As the sun set and the long shadows across the obliterated landscape began to fade, the night offered new opportunities and dangers. In this video, I'll cover some of the details about nighttime activities and operations of the Great War. You might assume that the night would bring the opportunity for some much-needed rest to the weary soldiers, but the men at the front lines did not enjoy that luxury. At night, if they had the chance to sleep at all, it would only be for an hour or so at a time. The best time for sleep and relaxation was actually in the afternoon, but between the occasional artillery blast and shifts of trench duties, periods of sleep were short and sporadic. Nighttime was often the busiest and most dangerous time of day. It was time to go to work, repairing fortifications damaged in battle and digging new trenches. Shifts of working parties were arranged in both day and night to handle the manual labor of building and maintaining the trench systems. But under the cover of darkness, men could crawl out of the trenches to lay and repair barbed wire and other defenses in no man's land. In addition to the rebuilding efforts, a group of men could be selected for more stressful engagements: night patrols. Patrols generally consisted of a junior officer and 4 to 6 men, but the size and composition of the group could vary based on the assigned task. Before embarking on a patrol, these men would darken their faces with burnt cork or grease paint and lighten their gear to the bare essentials necessary for the mission. Any gear that may reflect a glint of light or produce an unwanted rattle would be left behind. There were 3 types of objectives for night patrols. Reconnaissance patrols would be sent to surveil the enemy and gather intel. The group of men would creep across no man's land slowly and carefully, sometimes crawling in a prone position through the mud and craters. Upon reaching the enemy trench line and finding a spot to remain concealed, they would eavesdrop to discern any important information or assess enemy morale and disposition. They would make note of any important positions they discovered, such as machine gun nests, weaknesses in wire defenses, listening posts, or new trench construction. After performing their recon, they would return back to their own trenches and report their findings. Combat patrols, on the other hand, were sent out for more aggressive measures. The patrol group would set out with a designated target. They would maneuver in, strike the target, usually with grenades or other explosives, and quickly retreat back to their trenches. Pre-planned escape routes were essential because the moment the attack commenced, the enemy would be alerted and begin firing in retaliation. These hit-and-run tactics were especially effective for destroying troublesome machine gun nests or punching an opening through enemy wire defenses. There was also the psychological impact of keeping the enemy harassed just enough to prevent them from getting too comfortable at night. Although these combat patrols were taking offensive action, they weren't intended to enter the enemy trenches. There was a third type of patrol for that: the trench raid. Trench raids were performed by larger groups, around 30 to 40 men. The goal of the trench raid was to enter the enemy trench and cause havoc, killing enemy soldiers, destroying fortifications, and capturing prisoners, along with important documents or equipment. These raids were some of the most brutal and chaotic engagements of the war. Instead of the standard issue rifles, members of a raiding party favored handguns, grenades, blades, and a variety of improvised bludgeoning weapons. This was up-close and personal fighting. Trench raids were sometimes supported by something called a box barrage. A box barrage is when artillery is continuously fired, so the shell impacts form a three-sided box shape around a designated area. During this barrage, the raiding party could enter the central area, while enemy reinforcements would be cut off on both flanks and the rear. So, just imagine being a soldier, jumping into an enemy trench in the dark, armed with a revolver and a dagger, and your own artillery is bursting to the left, right, and forward of your position, forming a barrier around you. That is incredible, and honestly terrifying for everyone involved. I found an enthralling account of this type of attack written in the official history of Australia in the War of 1914-18. On the night of May 5, 1916, Australian troops of the 20th Battalion in the Verdun salient came under attack by a German trench raid supported by a box barrage. Earlier that morning, German artillery had fired a few shells into the salient, and the Australians responded with several shots from their trench mortars. After that, the rest of the afternoon passed by peacefully without incident, when suddenly, at 7:40 p.m., a salvo from German field guns rained down on the position. This was immediately followed by light and heavy artillery fire, descending so thickly that the region was immediately drowned in the continuous deafening uproar of the explosions. The bombardment had cut all the telephone lines to the area, and the communication trenches were torn apart and blocked. The officers at battalion headquarters 600 yards away and the men from the neighboring units outside the barrage area looked on in dismay while not a single word of communication could be obtained from the salient. For nearly 2 hours, the barrage continued and the Australians were completely cut off from their fellow soldiers. Once the German artillery finally ceased, officers and the men from the reserve trenches moved in to piece together what had just happened. They were surprised to find the area still in Australian hands. Many of the men had tried to take shelter when the artillery began. However, they noticed that 2 of their trench mortars were gone, several infantrymen were missing, and they found some unused German grenades dropped on the ground. After further investigation, observers reported that during the barrage, by the light of the bursting shells, they had seen Germans running across no man's land and crossing the parapet into the Australian trenches. After the war, when access to the German records was granted, it was discovered that the primary objective of this raid was to determine if mining operations were underway on this portion of the Australian sector. The secondary objective was to take prisoners and equipment. It was confirmed in the reports that the Germans had taken the trench mortars and prisoners with minimal casualties. The Australians suffered 100 casualties and 11 prisoners taken in the raid. So, what efforts were made to defend against night patrols? The primary method was to have sentries on watch at listening posts. Listening posts were constructed at the end of a narrow trench protruding into no man's land from the fire trench. They were made just large enough for 2 men to fit and remain unobserved. The position out beyond the fire trench provided a better field of view. It was strict practice not to fire any weapons from the listening posts during the day to prevent drawing attention to their locations. During the night, the sentries would man the post to keep a sharp eye and ear out for enemy activity and patrols. A cord or wire would be run back to the fire trench to another sentry or attached to a bell. A code of tugs on the line was used to signal or alert for emergencies. The sentries were instructed to fire, without challenge, at anyone approaching within sight unless notified that a friendly patrol was returning. In fact, all the patrols I discussed previously would leave and return to their trench line from a listening post. It was imperative to let the sentries know the patrol was embarking and the approximate time of return. When a friendly patrol returned, the sentry was to challenge audibly, and if not immediately satisfied with the response, begin firing. For those on the night patrol, returning to their own trench was often just as dangerous as approaching the enemy lines. A nervous sentry in the dark could spell disaster when friend was mistaken for foe. What other equipment did soldiers have at their disposal to assist in night fighting? Illumination shells could be used to temporarily light up an area. These could be fired into the air by flare pistols, rockets, or artillery. Once launched, a timed fuse would ignite the pyrotechnic element and burn brightly, while a small parachute slowed its descent. Depending on the size and type, these could cast light onto the battlefield for about 15 to 60 seconds. Searchlights were predominantly used as defense against air attacks in cities. However, they could be positioned in the trenches as well. A method to produce artificial moonlight was devised by focusing searchlights on the underside of a cloud. The powerful light beam diffusing and reflecting off the cloud would produce a soft glow over the area. This method continued to be used into World War II. Furthermore, beginning in the latter half of 1916, some units may have had access to radium sights. These attached to the existing sights of a weapon and were marked with a luminescent paint that glowed in the dark. The reactive element mixed with radium and zinc sulfide determined the color. For example, copper produced a green glow. They were not meant for long-range marksmanship, but allowed a better sight picture and aiming in short-range engagements at night. This paint was also used on watch faces and other dials and gauges used for vehicles and machinery. There's a tragic side note to make about the use of this paint. As the name implies, it contains radium-226, a radioactive element with a half-life of 1600 years. In the United States, most of the workers in the factories where the paint was applied were women. These women were instructed to use their lips to form a sharp tip on their paintbrushes for the detailed work. This led to the workers ingesting small amounts of radium hundreds of times a day. They were never told about the dangers of radium. Beginning in 1917 and into the 1920s, many of the women began to fall ill, losing teeth and developing blood and bone disorders. In 1928, 5 of the women brought a lawsuit against their employer, the United States Radium Corporation. They became known as the Radium Girls in the media. The case was settled out of court, and the women received financial compensation and a guarantee to have their medical expenses covered. Sadly, most of them died in the 1930s from their exposure to radium. The incident was a landmark case in bringing attention to workers' rights and reforming labor laws in the US. Back in the trenches, as night came to an end, soldiers were given the Stand To order just before dawn. They took defensive positions throughout their frontline trenches and waited with rifles ready and bayonets fixed. The break of dawn was the most common time for large-scale enemy attacks. When it seemed that no attack was coming, they were ordered to stand down and gathered for morning inspections and breakfast. Then, the day's working parties would be organized, and the chance for sleep might finally be granted. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something new. I'm Retromanzer, and I love history. I also love gaming. My goal is to share some of my love and knowledge of history, and I use games as a visual aid when I can. If you have a question about World War I, or you're just enjoying the videos, feel free to let me know in the comments, or consider giving the video a like. It's nice to see some people are enjoying these. I might not be able to cover every topic, but if enough people are interested in something, I can see what I can do for a future video. Your question might inspire something new for us to learn. Until next time, take care and be well.